The new god of invulnerability. The new gods of invulnerability. The new god of invulnerability. The new goddess of invulnerability. The new goddesses of invulnerability. The new goddess of invulnerability. The old god of invulnerability. The old gods of invulnerability. The old god of invulnerability. The old goddess of invulnerability. The old goddesses of invulnerability. The old goddess of invulnerability. The greater god of invulnerability. The greater gods of invulnerability. The greater god of invulnerability. The greater goddess of invulnerability. The greater goddesses of invulnerability. The greater goddess of invulnerability. The lesser god of invulnerability. The lesser gods of invulnerability. The lesser god of invulnerability. The lesser goddess of invulnerability. The lesser goddesses of invulnerability. The lesser goddess of invulnerability. The higher god of invulnerability. The higher gods of invulnerability. The higher god of invulnerability. The higher goddess of invulnerability. The higher goddesses of invulnerability. The higher goddess of invulnerability. The lower god of invulnerability. The lower gods of invulnerability. The lower god of invulnerability. The lower goddess of invulnerability. The lower goddesses of invulnerability. The lower goddess of invulnerability. The greater spirit of invulnerability. The greater spirits of invulnerability. The greater spirit of invulnerability. The lesser spirit of invulnerability. The lesser spirits of invulnerability. The lesser spirit of invulnerability. The higher spirit of invulnerability. The higher spirits of invulnerability. The higher spirit of invulnerability. The lower spirit of invulnerability. The lower spirits of invulnerability. The lower spirit of invulnerability. The major god of invulnerability. The major gods of invulnerability. The major god of invulnerability. The major goddess of invulnerability. The major goddesses of invulnerability. The major goddess of invulnerability. The minor god of invulnerability. The minor gods of invulnerability. The minor god of invulnerability. The minor goddess of invulnerability. The minor goddesses of invulnerability. The minor goddess of invulnerability. The superior god of invulnerability. The superior gods of invulnerability. The superior god of invulnerability. The superior goddess of invulnerability. The superior goddesses of invulnerability. The superior goddess of invulnerability. The inferior god of invulnerability. The inferior gods of invulnerability. The inferior god of invulnerability. The inferior goddess of invulnerability. The inferior goddesses of invulnerability. The inferior goddess of invulnerability. The ancestor god of invulnerability. The ancestor gods of invulnerability. The ancestor god of invulnerability. The ancestor goddess of invulnerability. The ancestor goddesses of invulnerability. The ancestor goddess of invulnerability. The ascendant god of invulnerability. The ascendant gods of invulnerability. The ascendant god of invulnerability. The ascendant goddess of invulnerability. The ascendant goddesses of invulnerability. The ascendant goddess of invulnerability. The descendant god of invulnerability. The descendant gods of invulnerability. The descendant god of invulnerability. The descendant goddess of invulnerability. The descendant goddesses of invulnerability. The descendant goddess of invulnerability. The transcendent god of invulnerability. The transcendent gods of invulnerability. The transcendent god of invulnerability. The transcendent goddess of invulnerability. The transcendent goddesses of invulnerability. The transcendent goddess of invulnerability. The past god of invulnerability. The past gods of invulnerability. The past god of invulnerability. The past goddess of invulnerability. The past goddesses of invulnerability. The past goddess of invulnerability. The present god of invulnerability. The present gods of invulnerability. The present god of invulnerability. The present goddess of invulnerability. The present goddesses of invulnerability. The present goddess of invulnerability. The future god of invulnerability. The future gods of invulnerability. The future god of invulnerability. The future goddess of invulnerability. The future goddesses of invulnerability. The future goddess of invulnerability. The authentic god of invulnerability. The authentic gods of invulnerability. The authentic god of invulnerability. The authentic goddess of invulnerability. The authentic goddess is of invulnerability. The authentic goddess of invulnerability. The synthetic god of invulnerability. The synthetic gods of invulnerability. The synthetic god of invulnerability. The synthetic goddess of invulnerability. The synthetic goddess is of invulnerability. The synthetic goddess of invulnerability. The progressive god of invulnerability. The progressive gods of invulnerability. The progressive god of invulnerability. The progressive goddess of invulnerability. The progressive goddesses of invulnerability. The progressive goddess of invulnerability. The regressive god of invulnerability. The regressive gods of invulnerability. The regressive god of invulnerability. The regressive goddess of invulnerability. The regressive goddesses of invulnerability. The regressive goddess of invulnerability. The ordinary god of invulnerability. The ordinary gods of invulnerability. The ordinary god of invulnerability. The ordinary goddess of invulnerability. The ordinary goddesses of invulnerability. The ordinary goddess of invulnerability. The extraordinary god of invulnerability. The extraordinary gods of invulnerability. The extraordinary god of invulnerability. The extraordinary goddess of invulnerability. The extraordinary goddesses of invulnerability. The extraordinary goddess of invulnerability. The static god of invulnerability. The static gods of invulnerability. The static god of invulnerability. The static goddess of invulnerability. The static goddesses of invulnerability. The static goddess of invulnerability. The dynamic god of invulnerability. The dynamic gods of invulnerability. The dynamic god of invulnerability. The dynamic goddess of invulnerability. The dynamic goddesses of invulnerability. The dynamic goddess of invulnerability. The land god of invulnerability. The land gods of invulnerability. The land god of invulnerability. The land goddess of invulnerability. The land goddesses of invulnerability. The land goddess of invulnerability. The sea god of invulnerability. The sea gods of invulnerability. The sea god of invulnerability. The sea goddess of invulnerability. The sea goddesses of invulnerability. The sea goddess of invulnerability. The sky god of invulnerability. The sky gods of invulnerability. The sky god of invulnerability. The sky goddess of invulnerability. The sky goddesses of invulnerability. The sky goddess of invulnerability. The god of invulnerability. The gods of invulnerability. The god of invulnerability. The goddess of invulnerability. The goddesses of invulnerability. The goddess of invulnerability. The half-god of invulnerability. The half-gods of invulnerability. The half-god of invulnerability. The half-goddess of invulnerability. The half-goddesses of invulnerability. The half-goddess of invulnerability. The vessel of invulnerability. The vessels of invulnerability. The vessel of invulnerability. The name of invulnerability. The names of invulnerability. The name of invulnerability. The person of invulnerability. The persons of invulnerability. The person of invulnerability. The persona of invulnerability. The personas of invulnerability. The persona of invulnerability. The personage of invulnerability. The personages of invulnerability. The personage of invulnerability. The personality of invulnerability. The personalities of invulnerability. The personality of invulnerability. The personification of invulnerability. The personifications of invulnerability. The personification of invulnerability. The image of invulnerability. The images of invulnerability. The image of invulnerability. The imagination of invulnerability. The imaginations of invulnerability. The imagination of invulnerability. The belief of invulnerability. The beliefs of invulnerability. The belief of invulnerability. The thought of invulnerability. The thoughts of invulnerability. The thought of invulnerability. The word of invulnerability. The words of invulnerability. The word of invulnerability. The action of invulnerability. The actions of invulnerability. The action of invulnerability. The reaction of invulnerability. The reactions of invulnerability. The reaction of invulnerability. The feeling of invulnerability. The feelings of invulnerability. The feeling of invulnerability. The situation of invulnerability. The situations of invulnerability. The situation of invulnerability. The circumstance of invulnerability. The circumstances of invulnerability. The circumstance of invulnerability. The environment of invulnerability. The environments of invulnerability. The environment of invulnerability. The relationship of invulnerability. The relationships of invulnerability. The relationship of invulnerability. The number of invulnerability. The numbers of invulnerability. The number of invulnerability. The formula of invulnerability. The formulas of invulnerability. The formula of invulnerability. The equation of invulnerability. The equations of invulnerability. The equation of invulnerability. The theory of invulnerability. The theories of invulnerability. The theory of invulnerability. The symbol of invulnerability. The symbols of invulnerability. The symbol of invulnerability. The color of invulnerability. The colors of invulnerability. The color of invulnerability. The thing of invulnerability. The things of invulnerability. The thing of invulnerability. The way of invulnerability. The ways of invulnerability. The way of invulnerability. The place of invulnerability. The places of invulnerability. The place of invulnerability. The time of invulnerability. The times of invulnerability. The time of invulnerability. The event of invulnerability. The events of invulnerability. The event of invulnerability. The result of invulnerability. The results of invulnerability. The result of invulnerability. The crown of invulnerability. The crowns of invulnerability. The crown of invulnerability. The throne of invulnerability. The thrones of invulnerability. The throne of invulnerability. The invulnerability king. The invulnerability kings. The invulnerability kingdom. The invulnerability kingdoms. The invulnerability king subject. The invulnerability king subjects. The invulnerability king's dominion. The invulnerability king's dominions. The kingdom of invulnerability. The kingdoms of invulnerability. The kingdom of invulnerability. The invulnerability queen. The invulnerability queens. The invulnerability queendom. The invulnerability queendoms. The invulnerability queen subject. The invulnerability queen subjects. The invulnerability queen's dominion. The invulnerability queen's dominions. The queendom of invulnerability. The queendoms of invulnerability. The queendom of invulnerability. The invulnerability prince. The invulnerability princes. The invulnerability princedom. The invulnerability princedoms. The invulnerability prince's subject. The invulnerability prince's subjects. The invulnerability prince's dominion. The invulnerability prince's dominions. The princedom of invulnerability. The princedoms of invulnerability. The princedom of invulnerability. The invulnerability princess. The invulnerability princesses. The invulnerability princessdom. The invulnerability princessdoms. The invulnerability princess's subject. The invulnerability princess's subjects. The invulnerability princess's dominion. The invulnerability princess's dominions. The princessdom of invulnerability. The princessdoms of invulnerability. The princessdom of invulnerability. The lord of invulnerability. The lords of invulnerability. The lord of invulnerability. The lordess of invulnerability. The lordesses of invulnerability. The lordess of invulnerability. The priest of invulnerability. The priests of invulnerability. The priest of invulnerability. The priestess of invulnerability. The priestesses of invulnerability. The priestess of invulnerability. The ritual of invulnerability. The rituals of invulnerability. The ritual of invulnerability. The shrine of invulnerability. The shrines of invulnerability. The shrine of invulnerability. The temple of invulnerability. The temples of invulnerability. The temple of invulnerability. The leader of invulnerability. The leaders of invulnerability. The leader of invulnerability. The follower of invulnerability. The followers of invulnerability. The follower of invulnerability. The natural substance of invulnerability. The natural substances of invulnerability. The natural substance of invulnerability. The supernatural substance of invulnerability. The supernatural substances of invulnerability. The supernatural substance of invulnerability. The temporal substance of invulnerability. The temporal substances of invulnerability. The temporal substance of invulnerability. The spiritual substance of invulnerability. The spiritual substances of invulnerability. The spiritual substance of invulnerability. The natural form of invulnerability. The natural forms of invulnerability. The natural form of invulnerability. The supernatural form of invulnerability. The supernatural forms of invulnerability. The supernatural form of invulnerability. The temporal form of invulnerability. The temporal forms of invulnerability. The temporal form of invulnerability. The spiritual form of invulnerability. The spiritual forms of invulnerability. The spiritual form of invulnerability. The age of invulnerability. The ages of invulnerability. The age of invulnerability. The era of invulnerability. The eras of invulnerability. The era of invulnerability. The awakener of invulnerability. The awakeners of invulnerability. The awakener of invulnerability. The awakening of invulnerability. The awakenings of invulnerability. The awakening of invulnerability. The realm of invulnerability. The realms of invulnerability. The realm of invulnerability. The dimension of invulnerability. The dimensions of invulnerability. The dimension of invulnerability. The zone of invulnerability. The zones of invulnerability. The zone of invulnerability. The frequency of invulnerability. The frequencies of invulnerability. The frequency of invulnerability. The century of invulnerability. The centuries of invulnerability. The century of invulnerability. The millennium of invulnerability. The millenniums of invulnerability. The millennium of invulnerability. The purpose of invulnerability. The purposes of invulnerability. The purpose of invulnerability. The meaning of invulnerability. The meanings of invulnerability. The meaning of invulnerability. The culture of invulnerability. The cultures of invulnerability. The culture of invulnerability. The demonstrator of invulnerability. The demonstrators of invulnerability. The demonstrator of invulnerability. The demonstration of invulnerability. The demonstrations of invulnerability. The demonstration of invulnerability. The manifester of invulnerability. The manifestors of invulnerability. The manifester of invulnerability. The manifestation of invulnerability. The manifestations of invulnerability. The manifestation of invulnerability. The presence of invulnerability. The presences of invulnerability. The presence of invulnerability. The glow of invulnerability. The glows of invulnerability. The glow of invulnerability. The goal of invulnerability. The goals of invulnerability. The goal of invulnerability. The plan of invulnerability. The plans of invulnerability. The plan of invulnerability. The book of invulnerability. The books of invulnerability. The book of invulnerability. The philosopher of invulnerability. The philosophers of invulnerability. The philosopher of invulnerability. The philosophy of invulnerability. The philosophies of invulnerability. The philosophy of invulnerability. The releaser of invulnerability. The releasers of invulnerability. The releaser of invulnerability. The release of invulnerability. The releases of invulnerability. The release of invulnerability. The variable of invulnerability. The variables of invulnerability. The variable of invulnerability. The cause of invulnerability. The causes of invulnerability. The cause of invulnerability. The effect of invulnerability. The effects of invulnerability. The effect of invulnerability. The journey of invulnerability. The journeys of invulnerability. The journey of invulnerability. The emergence of invulnerability. The emergences of invulnerability. The emergence of invulnerability. The source of invulnerability. The sources of invulnerability. The source of invulnerability. The originator of invulnerability. The originators of invulnerability. The originator of invulnerability. The origin of invulnerability. The origins of invulnerability. The origin of invulnerability. The forefather of invulnerability. The forefathers of invulnerability. The forefather of invulnerability. The foremother of invulnerability. The foremothers of invulnerability. The foremother of invulnerability. The ancestor of invulnerability. The ancestors of invulnerability. The ancestor of invulnerability. The descendant of invulnerability. The descendants of invulnerability. The descendant of invulnerability. The lineage of invulnerability. The lineages of invulnerability. The lineage of invulnerability. The heritage of invulnerability. The heritages of invulnerability. The heritage of invulnerability. The heir of invulnerability. The heirs of invulnerability. The heir of invulnerability. The co-heir of invulnerability. The co-heirs of invulnerability. The co-heir of invulnerability. The joint heir of invulnerability. The joint heirs of invulnerability. The joint heir of invulnerability. The dynasty of invulnerability. The dynasties of invulnerability. The dynasty of invulnerability. The force of invulnerability. The forces of invulnerability. The force of invulnerability. The law of invulnerability. The laws of invulnerability. The law of invulnerability. The pact of invulnerability. The pacts of invulnerability. The pact of invulnerability. The game of invulnerability. The games of invulnerability. The game of invulnerability. The mask of invulnerability. The masks of invulnerability. The mask of invulnerability. The armor of invulnerability. The armors of invulnerability. The armor of invulnerability. The sword of invulnerability. The swords of invulnerability. The sword of invulnerability. The shield of invulnerability. The shields of invulnerability. The shield of invulnerability. The force shield of invulnerability. The force shields of invulnerability. The force shield of invulnerability. The armored force shield of invulnerability. The armored force shields of invulnerability. The armored force shield of invulnerability. The champion of invulnerability. The champions of invulnerability. The champion of invulnerability. The guardian of invulnerability. The guardians of invulnerability. The guardian of invulnerability. The defender of invulnerability. The defenders of invulnerability. The defender of invulnerability. The protector of invulnerability. The protectors of invulnerability. The protector of invulnerability. The chant of invulnerability. The chants of invulnerability. The chant of invulnerability. The shape of invulnerability. The shapes of invulnerability. The shape of invulnerability. The cube of invulnerability. The cubes of invulnerability. The cube of invulnerability. The cuboid of invulnerability. The cuboids of invulnerability. The cuboid of invulnerability. The sphere of invulnerability. The spheres of invulnerability. The sphere of invulnerability. The spheroid of invulnerability. The spheroids of invulnerability. The spheroid of invulnerability. The prism of invulnerability. The prisms of invulnerability. The prism of invulnerability. The pyramid of invulnerability. The pyramids of invulnerability. The pyramid of invulnerability. The cylinder of invulnerability. The cylinders of invulnerability. The cylinder of invulnerability. The cone of invulnerability. The cones of invulnerability. The cone of invulnerability. The triangle of invulnerability. The triangles of invulnerability. The triangle of invulnerability. The circle of invulnerability. The circles of invulnerability. The circle of invulnerability. The semicircle of invulnerability. The semicircles of invulnerability. The semicircle of invulnerability. The square of invulnerability. The squares of invulnerability. The square of invulnerability. The rectangle of invulnerability. The rectangles of invulnerability. The rectangle of invulnerability. The parallelogram of invulnerability. The parallelograms of invulnerability. The parallelogram of invulnerability. The rhombus of invulnerability. The rhombuses of invulnerability. The rhombus of invulnerability. The trapezoid of invulnerability. The trapezoids of invulnerability. The trapezoid of invulnerability. The polygon of invulnerability. The polygons of invulnerability. The polygon of invulnerability. The pentagon of invulnerability. The pentagons of invulnerability. The pentagon of invulnerability. The hexagon of invulnerability. The hexagons of invulnerability. The hexagon of invulnerability. The septagon of invulnerability. The septagons of invulnerability. The septagon of invulnerability. The octagon of invulnerability. The octagons of invulnerability. The octagon of invulnerability. The nonagon of invulnerability. The nonagons of invulnerability. The nonagon of invulnerability. The decagon of invulnerability. The decagons of invulnerability. The decagon of invulnerability. The evolution of invulnerability. The evolutions of invulnerability. The evolution of invulnerability. The revolution of invulnerability. The revolutions of invulnerability. The revolution of invulnerability. The elemental art of invulnerability. The elemental arts of invulnerability. The elemental art of invulnerability. The elemental science of invulnerability. The elemental sciences of invulnerability. The elemental science of invulnerability. The elemental principle of invulnerability. The elemental principles of invulnerability. The elemental principle of invulnerability. The elemental technology of invulnerability. The elemental technologies of invulnerability. The elemental technology of invulnerability. The low elemental art of invulnerability. The low elemental arts of invulnerability. The low elemental art of invulnerability. The low elemental science of invulnerability. The low elemental sciences of invulnerability. The low elemental science of invulnerability. The low elemental principle of invulnerability. The low elemental principles of invulnerability. The low elemental principle of invulnerability. The low elemental technology of invulnerability. The low elemental technologies of invulnerability. The low elemental technology of invulnerability. The high elemental art of invulnerability. The high elemental arts of invulnerability. The high elemental art of invulnerability. The high elemental science of invulnerability. The high elemental sciences of invulnerability. The high elemental science of invulnerability. The high elemental principle of invulnerability. The high elemental principles of invulnerability. The high elemental principle of invulnerability. The high elemental technology of invulnerability. The high elemental technologies of invulnerability. The high elemental technology of invulnerability. The agent of invulnerability. The agents of invulnerability. The agent of invulnerability. The agency of invulnerability. The agencies of invulnerability. The agency of invulnerability. The amplifier of invulnerability. The amplifiers of invulnerability. The amplifier of invulnerability. The amplification of invulnerability. The amplifications of invulnerability. The amplification of invulnerability. The enhancer of invulnerability. The enhancers of invulnerability. The enhancer of invulnerability. The enhancement of invulnerability. The enhancements of invulnerability. The enhancement of invulnerability. The magnifier of invulnerability. The magnifiers of invulnerability. The magnifier of invulnerability. The magnification of invulnerability. The magnifications of invulnerability. The magnification of invulnerability. The influencer of invulnerability. The influencers of invulnerability. The influencer of invulnerability. The influence of invulnerability. The influences of invulnerability. The influence of invulnerability. The emanator of invulnerability. The emanators of invulnerability. The emanator of invulnerability. The emanation of invulnerability. The emanations of invulnerability. The emanation of invulnerability. The converger of invulnerability. The convergers of invulnerability. The converger of invulnerability. The convergence of invulnerability. The convergences of invulnerability. The convergence of invulnerability. The aura of invulnerability. The auras of invulnerability. The aura of invulnerability. The impression of invulnerability. The impressions of invulnerability. The impression of invulnerability. The intelligence of invulnerability. The intelligences of invulnerability. The intelligence of invulnerability. The sophistication of invulnerability. The sophistications of invulnerability. The sophistication of invulnerability. The genius of invulnerability. The geniuses of invulnerability. The genius of invulnerability. The polymath of invulnerability. The polymaths of invulnerability. The polymath of invulnerability. The psychic of invulnerability. The psychics of invulnerability. The psychic of invulnerability. The knowledge of invulnerability. The knowledges of invulnerability. The knowledge of invulnerability. The understanding of invulnerability. The understandings of invulnerability. The understanding of invulnerability. The wisdom of invulnerability. The wisdoms of invulnerability. The wisdom of invulnerability. The secret of invulnerability. The secrets of invulnerability. The secret of invulnerability. The mystery of invulnerability. The mysteries of invulnerability. The mystery of invulnerability. The revelation of invulnerability. The revelations of invulnerability. The revelation of invulnerability. The tactic of invulnerability. The tactics of invulnerability. The tactic of invulnerability. The strategy of invulnerability. The strategies of invulnerability. The strategy of invulnerability. The strength of invulnerability. The strengths of invulnerability. The strength of invulnerability. The might of invulnerability. The mights of invulnerability. The might of invulnerability. The power of invulnerability. The powers of invulnerability. The power of invulnerability. The authority of invulnerability. The authorities of invulnerability. The authority of invulnerability. The dominion of invulnerability. The dominions of invulnerability. The dominion of invulnerability. The rhythm of invulnerability. The rhythms of invulnerability. The rhythm of invulnerability. The melody of invulnerability. The melodies of invulnerability. The melody of invulnerability. The music of invulnerability. The musics of invulnerability. The music of invulnerability. The lyric of invulnerability. The lyrics of invulnerability. The lyric of invulnerability. The song of invulnerability. The songs of invulnerability. The song of invulnerability. The dance of invulnerability. The dances of invulnerability. The dance of invulnerability. The spirit of invulnerability. The spirits of invulnerability. The spirit of invulnerability. The soul of invulnerability. The souls of invulnerability. The soul of invulnerability. The body of invulnerability. The bodies of invulnerability. The body of invulnerability. The mark of invulnerability. The marks of invulnerability. The mark of invulnerability. The promise of invulnerability. The promises of invulnerability. The promise of invulnerability. The visionary of invulnerability. The visionaries of invulnerability. The visionary of invulnerability. The vision of invulnerability. The visions of invulnerability. The vision of invulnerability. The picture of invulnerability. The pictures of invulnerability. The picture of invulnerability. The sound of invulnerability. The sounds of invulnerability. The sound of invulnerability. The dung of invulnerability. The dungs of invulnerability. The dung of invulnerability. The language of invulnerability. The languages of invulnerability. The language of invulnerability. The communication of invulnerability. The communications of invulnerability. The communication of invulnerability. The people of invulnerability. The peoples of invulnerability. The people of invulnerability. The society of invulnerability. The societies of invulnerability. The society of invulnerability. The fortress of invulnerability. The fortresses of invulnerability. The fortress of invulnerability. The government of invulnerability. The governments of invulnerability. The government of invulnerability. The city of invulnerability. The cities of invulnerability. The city of invulnerability. The nation of invulnerability. The nations of invulnerability. The nation of invulnerability. The civilization of invulnerability. The civilizations of invulnerability. The civilization of invulnerability. The world of invulnerability. The worlds of invulnerability. The world of invulnerability.